I want to tell you a story about my daughter's wedding day. An act of pure hatred shattered a day that should have been the happiest of her life. The woman who pulled the trigger was the president of our homeowners association, and she did it because she couldn't stand the sight of our black family celebrating in a neighborhood she thought was hers to control. What she didn't know was who I really am. She thought her little bit of power was the ultimate authority. She had no idea she was targeting the family of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This is the story of how I used the full weight of the law to ensure she lost everything: her freedom, her home, and her future. Before we proceed to the next, if you're enjoying our stories, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us out, and I'd love to know where you are joining us from today. Please drop a comment below and say hello from your part of the country. The morning of my daughter Emma's wedding, I stood by the window and watched as the sun came up, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and peach. It was going to be a beautiful day. Later, I watched my little girl, 25 years old and glowing with happiness, as she fixed her veil in the mirror. For over 2 decades, I've served as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I've presided over the most difficult cases you can imagine, made rulings that shaped our state's laws, and have always tried my best to uphold justice. But I can tell you, none of that. Not a single moment in my entire career ever filled me with the kind of overwhelming pride and love I felt watching my daughter get ready to marry the man of her dreams. "Dad, you have to stop crying," Emma laughed, her own eyes shining as she reached up to adjust my tie. Her fingers were gentle. "You're supposed to be the strong one, remember? Mom's already working her way through a second box of tissues." I wiped my eyes and smiled back at her, my mind flashing back to the day she was born. Even then, all those 25 years ago, she had this strong spirit about her. As a toddler, she was the one who'd stand up to bigger kids if they were being unkind. In high school, she organized walkouts to protest unfair policies. And in college, she chose to study social work, not for the money, but because she genuinely wanted to be a force for good in the world to help those who couldn't help themselves. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I said, my voice a little thick. It's hard to believe my baby is all grown up and getting married. I swear it was just yesterday you were 6 years old, insisting on wearing your princess dress and tiara to the grocery store." Emma's eyes grew soft. "And you let me," she whispered, "even when people stared. You always told me I should be proud of who I am and to never, ever let anyone make me feel small." We were holding the wedding at our home in Maple Grove. We'd moved there 15 years ago, not long after I was first appointed to the bench. Emma had always dreamed of getting married right there in our backyard, under the big old oak tree where we'd hung a tire swing for her when she was small. My wife, Sarah, had a real gift for gardening, and her white roses were in full bloom, filling the air with their sweet scent. The chairs were all set up in neat rows on the emerald green lawn, and a beautiful arch stood waiting, decorated with ribbons and flowers that matched the bouquet Emma would carry. For the most part, the neighborhood had been a wonderful place to raise a family. When we first moved in, our neighbors were friendly, a mix of professional families who seemed happy to have a judge living on the street. We went to block parties, contributed to community gardens, and Sarah even served on the local school board for several years. But beneath the surface, a problem had been growing, festering like a sickness. And her name was Margaret Henderson. Margaret was the president of our homeowners association. She was a woman in her early 50s with sharp, angular features and a tongue that could be even sharper. She'd moved into Maple Grove about 5 years after we did and had immediately started inserting herself into every neighborhood issue. Within a couple of years, she'd gotten herself elected HOA president, campaigning on what she called maintaining property values and community standards. Now, over time, we all learned what those code words really meant. Margaret had a deep-seated problem with anyone who didn't look like her or live their life exactly the way she thought was proper. The trouble for us started about 3 months before the wedding, when we submitted our application to the HOA for an outdoor wedding event. We'd done everything by the book, filled out all the paperwork, paid all the fees. We'd even gone the extra mile, personally visiting every neighbor within 2 blocks to talk about our plans, invite them to attend, and assure them we'd be respectful. The very next evening, Margaret Henderson was on our doorstep, her face tight with an anger she was barely keeping in check. "Justice Williams," she said, her voice dripping with a false, syrupy politeness. "I'm sure a man in your position understands that Maple Grove has certain standards to maintain. A large wedding with music, catering trucks, and guests carrying on until all hours. Well, it simply isn't acceptable for a quiet residential neighborhood like ours." I took a deep breath and kept my voice calm and measured, the way I've learned to do over years of dealing with difficult people in my courtroom. "Mrs. Henderson, we've followed all the proper procedures. The event is well within the city's noise and gathering guidelines. We have all the necessary permits right here, and as you know, we've personally spoken with all the immediate neighbors." Her face flushed an ugly shade of red. "I don't particularly care about your city guidelines," she snapped, her mask of politeness slipping. "I am the HOA president, and I am telling you that we do not want loud parties in this neighborhood. People like you always think you can do whatever you want, just because of your position. This is a respectable community, not some inner-city party zone." People like you. Inner-city party zone. The racist meaning behind her words was as clear as day. Throughout my career, as one of the very few black chief justices in the entire country, I'd faced this kind of prejudice before. But I never expected to encounter it on my own doorstep, from a woman whose tax dollars helped pay my salary. "Mrs. Henderson," I replied, choosing my words with care, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is a wedding celebration for my daughter. We're not asking for anything that isn't perfectly allowed under the community rules and the city ordinances." But Margaret wasn't listening. She launched into a furious rant about property values, the reputation of the neighborhood, and how certain people were always trying to push boundaries and change the character of what she called established communities. Emma was heartbroken when Margaret began her campaign of harassment. The HOA president sent out letters to every single homeowner, warning them about the disruptive and potentially illegal event we were planning. She called the police on us multiple times with noise complaints while we were just setting up during the daytime. She even tried to get the city to revoke our event permit, claiming we had lied on our application. "Dad," Emma had said to me one evening, her voice heavy with worry, Maybe we should just move the wedding to a hotel. It would be easier." "Absolutely not," I told her, my voice firm. "This is your home. This is where you grew up. This is where you took your first steps and learned to ride your bike. This is where your grandparents came to visit every single Christmas. No one, and I mean no one, has the right to take this day away from you." But Margaret's constant harassment was stealing the joy from what should have been a happy planning period. Emma started having nightmares about the wedding going horribly wrong. She worried that guests wouldn't come because they were afraid of a confrontation. She even talked about making the celebration smaller and quieter, just to avoid giving Margaret any reason to complain. I had spent 30 years of my life fighting against injustice in courtrooms across this state. I was not about to let a small-minded, bigoted HOA president destroy my daughter's happiness. Now, as the guests began to arrive for the 2 o'clock ceremony, I tried to push all thoughts of Margaret Henderson out of my mind. This was Emma's day, and I was determined that nothing would ruin it. My wife, Sarah, looked stunning in a navy blue silk dress, greeting everyone with the warm, generous smile that had made me fall in love with her 30 years ago. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, making sure our older relatives had comfortable seats in the shade and helping parents keep track of excited children. Emma's future mother-in-law, Mrs. Chin, was a wonderful help, arranging the last of the flowers and making sure the bridal party had everything they needed. David's family had welcomed Emma with open arms, and his younger sister was a bridesmaid, standing right alongside Emma's closest friends from college. For a while, the afternoon was absolutely perfect. A soft breeze kept the summer heat at bay, and the backyard was filled with the lovely sound of laughter and happy conversation. Emma's college friends were sharing funny stories about her dating life before she met David. My old buddies from law school were clapping me on the back, congratulating me on raising such an amazing daughter. Sarah's friends from her book club were raving about the decorations and the delicious appetizers being passed around. And then I saw her. Margaret Henderson was standing at the very edge of our property line, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was dressed in head-to-toe black, looking as if she was attending a funeral, not a wedding. Her face was set in a hard, grim mask of disapproval, and she stared at our celebration with pure, undisguised hatred. Her husband, Harold, stood a few steps behind her, shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking profoundly uncomfortable, like he wished the earth would swallow him whole. Margaret had been watching our preparations all morning from her house across the street. She'd stood in her front yard, making notes on a clipboard and taking pictures with a camera that had a long lens. When the catering truck arrived, she rushed over to demand to see their license. When the musicians started their sound check, she immediately called the police to complain about noise, even though they were just tuning their instruments. "Just ignore her, honey," Sarah whispered, taking my arm and giving it a gentle squeeze. She had seen my jaw tighten. "Today is about Emma and David. Don't let that woman steal one more ounce of our joy." But I could see that Margaret's menacing presence was having an effect. Some of our guests kept glancing nervously in her direction. The musicians looked uneasy, and even the minister pulled me aside before the ceremony to ask quietly if there was going to be any trouble. The ceremony began at 2:30, right on schedule. When Emma appeared at the back door of our house, a hush fell over the crowd. She took my breath away. She was wearing her grandmother's vintage wedding dress, a beautiful lace gown that Sarah had spent months carefully altering to fit her perfectly. She had saved that dress for 40 years, just for this day. Emma walked down the aisle on my arm, glowing with a happiness that not even Margaret Henderson had been able to extinguish. Her fiancé, David, waited for her under the arch, and I saw the tears of pure joy streaming down his face. David is a good man, a kind man. He's a pediatric nurse who met Emma when she was volunteering at the children's hospital. He's gentle, he's devoted, and he loves my daughter with all his heart. The minister began the service with a prayer about love, commitment, and understanding, and for a few precious minutes, everything was perfect. Emma and David exchanged the vows they had written for each other, promising to support one another's dreams, to be patient with each other's flaws, and to build a family founded on love and mutual respect. And that's when Margaret Henderson made her move. "This is a violation of community standards," she screamed from the property line, her voice cutting through the peaceful afternoon like a shard of glass. "I'm calling the police right now. This illegal gathering ends today." A few guests turned to look, their faces showing confusion and concern. But the minister, God bless him, didn't miss a beat. He just kept right on going with the ceremony. Emma squeezed my hand and gave me a brave little smile, whispering, "We knew this might happen, Dad. Don't let her win." In that moment, I was so incredibly proud of my daughter's courage. Even with this woman screaming threats in the background, Emma kept her eyes locked on David, focused on the commitment they were making to each other. But Margaret wasn't finished. She stormed back across the street to her house, her black dress flowing behind her like a dark shadow. Harold followed her, trying to catch up, and from his gestures, it looked like he was desperately trying to talk her out of whatever she was planning. 5 minutes later, Margaret returned, and what I saw in her hands turned my blood to ice. My heart literally stopped in my chest for several terrifying seconds. Margaret Henderson was carrying a rifle. It was a hunting rifle, the kind used for deer, and she was holding it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. The weapon looked huge and menacing in her hands, the black metal gleaming coldly in the afternoon sun. "Everyone needs to leave, now!" she shrieked, waving the gun in the air above her head. "This illegal gathering ends today! I warned you people, and you just wouldn't listen!" Panic erupted through the crowd. Guests dove behind the white wooden chairs. Parents grabbed their children and started running toward the house. Mrs. Chin screamed and fell to her knees. The musicians dropped their expensive instruments and scrambled for cover behind their speakers. The minister stopped speaking mid-sentence and stepped back from the altar, his face as white as a sheet. David, without a moment's hesitation, moved directly in front of Emma, using his own body as a shield to protect her. "Mrs. Henderson," I called out, my voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through my veins. "Put the gun down, right now. Let's talk about this calmly. There is no need for weapons here." But Margaret Henderson was far beyond reason. Her face was twisted with rage and something else, a kind of manic triumph that she finally had everyone's undivided attention. She kept the rifle pointed toward the ceremony area, sweeping the barrel back and forth across the crowd of our terrified family and friends. "I warned you people months ago," she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "I told you this neighborhood has standards. You think because you're some big-shot judge you can just ignore the rules? You think you can bring your loud music and your crowds and ruin our peaceful community?" Harold appeared behind her, reaching tentatively for the gun. "Margaret, for God's sake, put it down! You're scaring people. This has gone too far." She spun around and pointed the rifle directly at her own husband. "Don't you dare touch me! I am tired of everyone in this neighborhood walking all over me. I'm tired of being ignored and disrespected." Emma and David were frozen at the altar, still holding hands, but now surrounded by utter chaos and terror. I could see the fear in my daughter's eyes, but I also saw her determination. She had inherited my stubborn streak, and she wasn't going to let this woman destroy her wedding day without a fight. "Please, Mrs. Henderson," Emma called out, her voice shaking but clear and brave. "This is just a wedding. We're here to celebrate love and family. We're not hurting anyone. Can't you please just let us have this one day?" And that's when everything went horribly, tragically wrong. Margaret swung the rifle toward Emma, her finger moving to the trigger. The barrel was now pointed directly at my daughter's heart. "Shut up!" Margaret screamed, her face contorted with pure hatred. "You and your family are ruining this neighborhood. You don't belong here. None of you belong here." Time seemed to slow down, the way it does in a nightmare. I saw Margaret's finger tighten on the trigger. I saw Emma standing there in her beautiful white dress, so innocent and perfect. I saw my wife Sarah screaming my name from somewhere behind me. I saw David trying to push Emma out of the way. And then I heard the gunshot. The sound was deafening, a single, violent crack that echoed off the houses and made the air itself vibrate. Birds exploded from the trees, and car alarms started blaring up and down the street. Emma crumpled to the ground. A dark, terrifying red began to spread across the white fabric of her grandmother's precious dress, blooming like a hideous flower. David dropped to his knees beside her, pressing his hands desperately against the wound in her shoulder. His white dress shirt was instantly soaked with her blood. "Emma! Emma!" I ran toward my daughter, but Sarah got there first, falling to her knees and cradling Emma's head in her lap. Our backyard descended into complete chaos. People were screaming, running in every direction. Someone tackled Margaret Henderson and wrestled the gun away from her. I found out later it was David's father, a Vietnam veteran who had seen that kind of danger before and knew exactly what to do. Harold Henderson was on his knees on the grass, sobbing, repeating, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," over and over again. In the distance, I could hear the beautiful sound of sirens, growing louder by the second. Someone had called 911, probably a dozen people had. But all I could see, all I could focus on, was my little girl lying on the ground in her wedding dress, her blood soaking through the delicate lace that had been saved for this one. Special day. "Dad," she whispered, as I knelt beside her and took her cold hand in mine. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry the wedding is ruined. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger. Tears streamed down my face as I held her hand. Don't you dare apologize, sweetheart, I said, my voice breaking. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. You were perfect. You were so brave and so beautiful. Emma tried to smile, but I could see the pain and shock clouding her eyes. Am I going to die, Dad? No, I said, with a firmness I didn't fully feel. No, you are not going to die. You're going to be just fine. The doctors are going to take care of you, and you and David are going to have a long, beautiful life together. But inside I was terrified. There was so much blood, and Emma was growing paler by the second. The paramedics arrived within minutes and took over. They were incredible, starting an IV, applying pressure to the wound, and carefully loading her onto a gurney and into the ambulance. Sarah and I climbed in with her, while David followed behind in his car, still wearing his blood-stained tuxedo. The emergency room was a blur of bright lights and frantic activity. Doctors and nurses rushed Emma into surgery while we filled out paperwork and answered 100 questions. David's family arrived, along with my brother and Sarah's parents. We all huddled together in the waiting room, still dressed in our wedding clothes, holding on to each other, praying and crying. The next 8 hours were the longest of my entire life. Emma was in surgery, and the doctors came out to tell us the damage was severe. The bullet had shattered her collarbone and done significant damage to the muscles and nerves in her right arm. They told us she might never regain full use of it. Margaret Henderson had been arrested at the scene. She was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and making terroristic threats. But as I sat in that cold, sterile waiting room, listening to my wife cry, I knew with absolute certainty that those charges were not nearly enough. My daughter's wedding day had been violently stolen from her. Her body was broken. Her dream of a perfect celebration in her own childhood home had been shattered by bigotry and hatred. And Margaret Henderson had no idea that she had just made an enemy of the most powerful judge in the state. Emma survived the surgery, but the road to recovery was going to be long and painful. The bullet had done extensive damage. She would need months, maybe years of physical therapy, and the doctors were still not sure if she would ever get full mobility back in her right arm. David was a rock through it all. During the 2 weeks she spent in the hospital, he never left her side. He learned how to help her eat, how to brush her teeth, how to get dressed. Their love for each other, if anything, grew even stronger through the trauma. But the Emma who left the hospital was not the same bright, confident young woman who had laughed at my tears that morning. The girl who had always stood up to bullies was gone, replaced by someone who flinched at sudden noises, who had nightmares about gunshots, and who couldn't bear to even talk about the possibility of another wedding ceremony. I just want to forget any of it ever happened, Dad, she told me one evening, staring blankly out her hospital window. I want to pretend it was all a bad dream. I want to go back to the way things were before. And that, right there, was the moment I knew exactly what I had to do. Margaret Henderson's case came up for its preliminary hearings about 2 weeks after the shooting. Her lawyer, a public defender named Robert Mills, was already trying to get the charges reduced to simple assault. He was claiming that Margaret had only been trying to defend her property, that she had just meant to fire a warning shot, and that Emma had been hit by accident. What Margaret and her lawyer didn't know was that after 30 years in the legal system, I had connections at every level. Judges I had mentored, prosecutors who respected my opinion, police officers I had worked with on reform committees. I started making phone calls. My first call was to the district attorney, Patricia Morris. We'd been friends since law school, and she'd worked her way up through the ranks over 20 hard years. Patricia, I said, sitting in my home office, surrounded by the law books and family photos that defined my life. I need to ask you for a personal favor. Anything, Robert, she said, her voice full of concern. How is Emma doing? We've all been thinking about your family. She's alive, I said, but she'll never be the same. The physical damage is one thing, but the emotional trauma... Patricia, I need you to throw the entire weight of your office at this case. Margaret Henderson didn't fire any warning shot. She tried to murder my daughter on her wedding day because she couldn't stand the sight of a black family celebrating in what she considered her neighborhood. There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Patricia knew what I was asking. As Chief Justice, I was supposed to be above this, to remain impartial. But this wasn't about the law anymore. This was about my daughter. "Consider it done," she said finally, her voice firm. "We'll make sure Henderson faces every single charge we can bring. I'm putting my best team on this." My next call was to the judge who would be presiding over the case, Harrison Blake. "Harrison," I began, "I'm calling about the Henderson shooting." "Robert, you know I can't discuss a pending case with you," he said, his tone cautious. "It would be highly inappropriate." "I'm not asking you to discuss it," I replied. "I'm telling you that this woman shot an innocent girl at her own wedding because of racial prejudice. The evidence is clear. The witnesses are solid. Do not let her lawyer manipulate the system to get her a slap on the wrist." Judge Blake was quiet for a long moment. He knew his appointment to the bench had come with my strong recommendation. He knew the influence I wielded. "I understand your concern, Robert," he said carefully. "Justice will be served according to the law." But my most important call was to the lead detective on the case, Maria Santos. "Detective Santos, this is Chief Justice Williams. I want to make sure your investigation has every resource it needs." "Yes, sir," she said. "We're building a very strong case. We have dozens of witnesses, video from security cameras, and all the physical evidence. But there's something else you should know, sir." "What is it?" I asked. "We're uncovering evidence that Margaret Henderson has been systematically harassing other minority families in this neighborhood for years, threatening letters, false police reports, vandalism. We're now looking at potential hate crime charges." My hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just a moment of rage. This was a pattern. She was a predator. "Detective," I said, my voice low and steady, "I want you to interview every single family she has ever targeted. Build a clear, undeniable pattern of behavior. I want the court to see exactly the kind of person we are dealing with." "We're already on it, sir," she replied. "We've found at least 6 other families. The Martinez family had their car keyed multiple times. The Johnsons found death threats in their mailbox. The Patels had their fence smashed and racist graffiti sprayed on their garage. We're going to make sure she never hurts anyone else." Over the next several weeks, I used every connection, every bit of influence I had built over my 3-decade career. I called in favors. I made recommendations. I ensured that the case against Margaret Henderson received the absolute highest priority and the most thorough attention. The investigation grew far beyond the single shooting. The police uncovered Margaret's 5-year campaign of terror against anyone she deemed other in Maple Grove. The trial began 4 months after the shooting. Emma was strong enough to testify, though she still wore a sling and her right hand trembled when she was nervous. She told the court about her wedding day, about the months of harassment, about lying on the ground in her grandmother's dress, certain she was dying. David testified about watching the love of his life get shot on what should have been their happiest day. My wife, Sarah, broke down on the stand as she described the horror of holding her daughter's bleeding body. The prosecution's case was devastating. They showed video from security cameras that clearly showed Henderson crossing onto our property with the loaded rifle. Witness after witness took the stand to describe her racist comments and threats over the years. But the most damning evidence of all came from Margaret's own mouth. During her police interrogation, she had said, and I quote, "I was tired of these people thinking they could do whatever they wanted in our neighborhood. Someone had to take a stand and show them they don't belong here. These people don't belong here." It was the same hateful language she'd been using for years. Her defense attorney tried to paint her as a stressed-out neighbor who had made a terrible mistake, blaming a recent divorce for her state of mind. But the evidence was overwhelming. The ballistics report proved the shot was aimed directly at Emma. The witnesses were unanimous about her intent. The years of harassment showed a pattern of premeditated hatred, not a moment of panic. The jury was out for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, terroristic threatening, and the hate crime enhancements, which doubled her potential sentence. When the verdict was read, Margaret Henderson collapsed in her chair, wailing about how her life was ruined. Her husband, Harold, who had stood by her through the whole ordeal, finally turned and walked away. He filed for divorce the very next week. Margaret Henderson was sentenced to 15 years in prison. She would not be eligible for parole for at least 8 years. But the criminal trial was only the beginning. Next came the civil lawsuit. Emma and David sued for medical expenses, for the lost wages from the jobs they had to leave, for the pain and suffering, and for the profound emotional distress. Their lawyer was the best in the state, a senior partner at a powerful firm who owed me more than a few favors from the early days of his career. The civil case was even more brutal than the criminal trial. The jury saw the full extent of Emma's injuries and the mountain of evidence about Henderson's long history of hatred. They awarded Emma and David a judgment of $2.3 million. Margaret Henderson lost everything to pay that judgment. Her house, her savings, her retirement accounts, everything she had. But I still wasn't finished. Using my connections throughout the legal community, I made sure that Margaret Henderson's name and story became known far and wide. Legal journals wrote articles about the case. Bar associations used it as a teaching example of how hatred corrupts and destroys. Her employer, a small accounting firm, fired her the day the verdict was read. Her professional CPA license was suspended and was almost certainly going to be permanently revoked. The Maple Grove HOA voted to remove her as president, and then, in an unprecedented move, voted to dissolve the entire organization rather than be associated with the liability and the shame of what she had done. Margaret Henderson went from being a woman who ruled her little neighborhood with an iron fist to a convicted felon who was unemployable, broke, and homeless. She ended up moving in with her elderly mother in another state. But even there, her story followed her. The internet never forgets. A simple search of her name would forever bring up her mugshot and the story of the racist HOA president who shot a bride on her wedding day. About 8 months after the trial, I received a letter at my chambers. It was handwritten on cheap lined paper, and the return address was the Women's Correctional Facility. Justice Williams, it began, in a shaky script. I know you will probably throw this letter away without reading it, but I need to try to apologize. I know what I did was wrong. I know I hurt your daughter and destroyed her special day. I was angry and scared, and I let my prejudices control my actions. I thought I was protecting my neighborhood, but I realize now I was just protecting my own narrow-minded view of the world. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I am sorry. I have lost everything. My house, my job, my husband, my reputation, and I deserve it all. I just hope your daughter can find peace and happiness despite what I did to her. I read that letter 3 times. Then I locked it away in my desk drawer. An apology couldn't give Emma back her wedding day. It couldn't erase the nightmares or the chronic pain in her arm. But it was an acknowledgement. She finally understood the full weight of the destruction her hatred had caused, not just to my family, but to her own life. Exactly 1 year after the shooting, Emma and David had a second wedding ceremony, and Emma insisted it be held in the exact same spot in our backyard. "I won't let her take this place away from me, Dad," she said, her voice filled with a strength I hadn't heard in a year. "This is my home. This is where I belong. This is where I want to start my married life." Her shoulder had healed enough for her to wear a beautiful sleeveless dress. though she would always have a limited range of motion in that arm. David had learned to be her partner in every sense, helping her with the things she couldn't manage alone. This ceremony was smaller, just our very closest family and friends. But it was perfect in a way the first one could never have been. There was no fear, no anger, no hatred. Just love and healing and hope for the future. As I walked my daughter down the aisle for the second time, I thought about the difference between justice and revenge. Justice was Margaret Henderson serving her 15-year sentence, paying her debt to society as defined by the law. Revenge was everything else, making sure she lost her reputation, her livelihood, her marriage, and every last dollar she had. Some people might say I abused my power, that I went too far in my pursuit of vengeance. Others would say I simply made sure that a dangerous, racist woman finally faced the full consequences of her actions. But as I watched Emma say her vows to David with tears of pure joy in her eyes, as I saw Sarah smiling and squeezing my hand, I knew in my heart that I had done the right thing. Margaret Henderson shot my daughter because she thought we were just another black family she could bully and intimidate. She had no idea I was the Chief Justice. She had no idea that attacking my family would bring the entire weight of the legal system crashing down on her head. She had no idea her moment of hate would cost her absolutely everything she had. But she knows now. She has plenty of time to remember it, sitting in her prison cell, thinking about the 15 years stretching out ahead of her, all because she couldn't tolerate the sight of a happy family who happened to be black, celebrating a wedding in their own backyard. At the reception, Emma threw her bouquet. It sailed through the air toward her laughing friends. David kissed his bride, and our small group cheered. The sun was setting behind our house, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was finally perfect.